Welcome to the Hot News Channel, where we strip away the noise to analyze today's breaking stories. It is Friday, March 6, 2026.
And today is not just another day of geopolitical tension. I mean, what we are witnessing right now, in real time, is the complete dismantling of a decades-old global security architecture.
Yeah.
The illusion of a swift, surgical, 4-day war has completely evaporated. What was intended as a decisive decapitation strike has metastasized into this sprawling, asymmetrical masterclass that is currently paralyzing the global economy. It's depleting Western military stockpiles at a completely unsustainable burn rate,
Right.
And it is fundamentally rewriting the rules of modern warfare right before our eyes.
Right, and just a quick note to you, the listener, before we really get deep into the weeds today. We are looking at some incredibly charged, raw intelligence from all sides of this ongoing United States and Israeli conflict with Iran. Our job here isn't to tell you who is right or wrong, to take a political stance, or to endorse any military actions or ideologies. We are just here to lay out the hard data, the dates, the numbers, the hardware specifications, and the military realities on the ground so you can make sense of it all yourself. I'll be strictly focusing on that raw data and the timelines, just trying to piece together the sequence of events.
And my focus will be on the macro level. I'll be pushing back on the official narratives we're hearing in the daily press briefings, exploring the devastating ripple effects this is having on the global stage, and really asking why the traditional models of power projection are failing so spectacularly right now.
So let's start with the hard data of the inciting incident, because you really need to understand the opening moves of this conflict from late February and early March to grasp how we got here. The United States and Israel launched what was designed to be a definitive war-ending decapitation strike in Tehran. The primary target was the 86-year-old Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei. Now, the medical intelligence data shows that he was reportedly already suffering from advanced prostate cancer. He was facing a severely limited lifespan anyway, but the strike successfully killed him, along with several of his immediate family members, including his daughter, his son-in-law, and his grandchildren who were present at the compound.
Right, the classic cut the head off the snake strategy.
Exactly. But there is another specific data point from this opening salvo that has drastically shifted the tone of the entire conflict, and it's a grim one. There was a highly controversial strike on a school in the town of Minab, which is down in southeastern Iran. The casualty numbers are just staggering. 168 schoolgirls, ranging in age from 7 to 12 years old, and 15 teachers were killed.
Yeah.
6 buildings in the immediate vicinity, including the school itself and a local community clinic, were completely leveled. And the munitions used for this were 2,000-pound bombs.
And we really need to pause on that detail, because the 2,000-pound bomb is not a precision sniper rifle. It is a massive piece of ordnance specifically designed to obliterate reinforced concrete bunkers or sink warships. When you drop munitions of that sheer kinetic magnitude on a soft civilian target like a primary school, the psychological shockwave it sends through a population is profound.
It's massive.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you have to look at the official narrative that was used to justify these massive opening moves. You had the U.S. Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth, publicly going to the podium and claiming that the United States would establish uncontested airspace over Iran in under a week.
Uncontested airspace, meaning they could fly wherever they wanted, whenever they wanted, without fear of being shot down.
Precisely. The official line from the Pentagon was that by utilizing their heavy hitters, the B-2 stealth bomber, the B-52 Stratofortresses, and the B-1 Lancers, they would achieve total absolute dominance. They painted a picture of flying day and night, picking off targets at will, essentially treating Iranian airspace like a training range.
But the data coming out of the defense sector shows that reality has forced a massive, immediate pivot. We are now seeing internal reports that the Pentagon is frantically staffing up for a 100-day war.
Wow.
They are signing logistical contracts and extending deployments, with projections potentially stretching all the way into September. The discrepancy between a surgical 4-day operation and a grueling, multi-month regional war spanning into the fall is absolutely glaring.
It's a colossal miscalculation, and I have to sharply disagree with the underlying premise that this shock and awe strategy could ever have worked against a nation like Iran in the first place. When we look at the analysis by Larry Johnson, a former CIA analyst, and the geopolitical breakdowns by Carl Zah, they point out a fundamental flaw in the coalition's thinking. Taking out the supreme leader did not cause the Iranian command structure to collapse into chaos. In fact, it did the exact opposite.
It triggered a pre-planned, highly decentralized contingency strategy.
Yes. Walk me through what that actually means on the ground. because standard military logic says if you lose your commander-in-chief, your forces are paralyzed.
Well, that's true in a rigid top-down hierarchy where every decision has to be rubber-stamped by a central committee. But by eliminating the top layer of political and religious leadership in Tehran, the U.S. and Israel essentially unshackled the Iranian military apparatus. They inadvertently granted immediate operational autonomy to mid-level commanders within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and the regular armed forces.
So they don't have to wait for orders anymore.
Exactly. These regional commanders no longer have to wait for a consensus from the political elites in the capital. They woke up, saw the leadership was gone, opened their safes, and pulled out their standing orders. They have a playbook, and they're executing it ruthlessly.
And when you look at the physical target data, you can see that clearly. These decentralized units aren't scrambling for instructions or firing randomly into the desert. They are systematically, methodically executing a predetermined target list across the entire Middle East. Right. And to understand why the Iranian population hasn't turned against their government, which is always the stated hope of these decapitation strikes, that the people will rise up and overthrow the regime once it shows weakness, we have to look at the massive ideological asymmetry at play here. According to the analysis by Dr. Roy Casagrande, the U.S. and Israeli military planners treated this as a standard geopolitical chess match.
Right.
You take out the king, the game is over, the opponent concedes. They relied on standard predictive history models based on past conflicts with conventional nations.
But Iran isn't treating this like a chess match.
Not at all. For Iran's 90 million citizens, this is not viewed as a mere political dispute over uranium enrichment or regional influence. It is viewed as a literal existential threat to their civilization, and crucially, it is viewed as a martyrdom event. The Shia faith, which is deeply ingrained in the Iranian cultural DNA, places immense cultural, historical, and religious weight on the concept of martyrdom.
Right, like the historical Battle of Karbala.
Exactly. It is central to their worldview. So when those 2,000-pound bombs hit that school in Manab, it did not break civilian morale, as the military planners might have calculated on their spreadsheets.
It had the opposite effect.
It unified the populace entirely around the flag. They see this now as a wholly anti-colonial war for survival. You simply cannot bomb a population into political compliance when they view dying for the cause as the ultimate honor, and they view their resistance as a divine necessity. It's like trying to put out a grease fire with a bucket of water. The very action you take to suppress it causes it to explode outward.
So if the civilian population is galvanized, and these mid-level military commanders are suddenly unleashed with pre-planned operational targets, what exactly are they aiming at? Because the data coming out of the Gulf bases is frankly terrifying, and it leads us right into the second major phase of this deep dive, the complete fall of the U.S. defense shield in the Middle East.
It's failing everywhere.
It is. Iran has launched massive, highly coordinated waves of ballistic missiles and suicide drones at U.S. installations across the entire region. We are talking about bases in the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Jordan, and Iraq.
The entire footprint of the American empire in the Gulf is under sustained bombardment.
Let's look at the specific data points, starting with Qatar. At the Al Udeid Air Base, which is the massive nerve center for U.S. air operations in the region, the ANFPS-132 early warning radar was completely destroyed. Now, I want to emphasize that this isn't just a spinning radar dish on a tower.
Right.
This is a massive solid-state phased array radar system. It is housed in a structure the size of a 10-story building. It costs over $1 billion to build and install. More importantly, there are only 6 of these systems in the entire world. It is the foundational node that detects deep space ballistic missile launches and coordinates the entire layered air defense grid for the theater. And the satellite imagery shows it is just gone.
And you have to understand the strategic blindness that creates. If you take out the eyes of the defense grid, every subsequent wave of attacks becomes exponentially more lethal because the automated defense systems don't have the early warning tracking data they rely on.
And the destruction doesn't stop there. The data shows the U.S. Fifth Fleet Naval Headquarters, which is based in Bahrain, has been heavily damaged. This is the command center responsible for naval forces in the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, Arabian Sea, and parts of the Indian Ocean. The satellite imagery coming in shows extensive destruction to their primary command centers and their secure communications terminals. From a functional, data-driven standpoint, it is essentially wiped out as a cohesive command node.
Which means the naval assets out in the water are suddenly operating with degraded communications and situational awareness.
Furthermore, we are tracking the destruction of U.S. THAAD systems. THAAD stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. These are the premier crown jewel anti-ballistic missile systems the U.S. fields. There are only 11 of these THAAD batteries deployed worldwide. The data confirms that 3 of them have already been destroyed in this opening phase.
That's incredible.
That is nearly 30% of the entire global inventory of U.S. high-altitude defense wiped off the board in a matter of days. Additionally, we're seeing reports that CIA stations attached to embassies across the region, including the highly fortified station in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, have caught fire and been totally evacuated.
This raises an incredibly important question that military academies will be studying for the next century. How is a heavily sanctioned, economically isolated nation like Iran systematically dismantling the physical, multi-billion-dollar infrastructure of the American military empire? To answer that, we have to analyze the terrifying economics of this exchange. According to the analysis by Andrei Martiam and Alex Craner, Iran is not fighting a traditional technological war. They are engaging in a brilliant, albeit brutal, war of economic attrition.
The math on this is fascinating. Walk us through how they are doing it.
They are flooding the airspace with cheap, mass-produced drones, primarily the Shahed series. A Shahed drone is essentially a flying lawnmower engine strapped to a warhead. It costs roughly $35,000 to $50,000 to manufacture. They are slow, they are loud, but they have decent range, and they are precise enough to hit a building. Now, the United States is responding to these $50,000 drones using their premier interceptors. They are firing THAAD interceptors, which cost between $12 million and $13 million each. They are also firing Patriot PAC-3 missiles, which cost well over $1 million each.
Let me stop you right there because I want to make sure the listener grasps this math. You are saying the U.S. is firing a $13 million missile to blow up a $50,000 drone.
Yes, the mathematical impossibility of this defense strategy is staggering. If Iran sends a swarm of 100 drones, that costs them maybe $5 million to produce. Pocket change for a nation-state. For the U.S. to shoot down that single swarm of 100 drones, assuming a perfect 1-to-1 kill ratio with THAADs, it would cost the United States $1.3 billion.
Wow.
And Iran isn't sending one swarm. They're sending wave after wave. You are spending tens of millions of dollars to shoot down a few $100,000 worth of low-tech fiberglass and explosives. And the absolute worst part, the drones that do get through the depleted defenses are the ones destroying the billion-dollar radar installations in the command centers. Iran is achieving a massive, theater-wide strategic effect without needing a technological peer-to-peer advantage. They don't need a stealth bomber to destroy a radar if a swarm of 200 cheap drones can exhaust the defenses and let one slip through.
And the stockpile depletion data backs up that economic attrition model completely. Let's look at the actual inventory numbers for the United States. Since the year 2015, the U.S. defense industry has produced roughly 4,620 Patriot PAC-3 missiles. That is the total cumulative inventory built over nearly a decade. Now remember that over 1,000 of those interceptors were already pulled from the stockpiles and sent to Ukraine over the last few years.
Right. The well was already drawn down before this war even started.
Exactly. And U.S. military doctrine, the standard operating procedure to ensure a target is actually destroyed, dictates firing 2 interceptors per incoming threat. So if you do the math, against thousands of incoming drones and ballistic missiles, firing 2 multi-million-dollar missiles at every target, the U.S. stockpile is simply evaporating. According to the analysis by Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson and Larry Johnson, the U.S. will physically run out of interceptors within weeks. And I want to stress, this isn't a speculative worst-case projection. It's basic arithmetic. You have X number of missiles in the warehouse, and you are firing Y number per day. At this burn rate, the warehouse is empty by the end of the month.
And when the warehouse in the Middle East is empty, what happens?
To resupply the theater, the Pentagon is reportedly being forced to make agonizing choices. They are actively considering stripping HAA and Patriot defense batteries from the Indo-Pacific Command, specifically pulling them out of South Korea and Japan and shipping them to the Gulf, which obviously leaves the Asian allies highly vulnerable to North Korea and China.
And that inter-service rivalry, the desperate need to strip vital defensive assets from the Pacific to fight a sudden sprawling war in the Middle East, is exactly the kind of strategic overextension that Iran and its allies are banking on. But the failures we are seeing aren't just on the ground with the missile defense batteries. The promised uncontested airspace that Secretary Hegseth bragged about has proven to be a deadly illusion for American pilots.
The aircraft loss data is truly shocking. We are tracking the loss of 3 F-15E Strike Eagles. Now, the F-15E is one of the most advanced, capable fighter bombers in the U.S. arsenal. It has a stellar combat record. But the data shows they weren't shot down by Iranian surface-to-air missiles. They were lost to friendly fire from Kuwaiti F-16s.
How does that happen in a modern, networked military?
It comes down to system saturation. The airspace over the Gulf is currently so dense, so utterly saturated with layers of drone swarms, incoming ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, and allied aircraft trying to intercept them, that the identification of friend or foe systems, the IFF systems, are actively failing amid the chaos.
Imagine trying to recognize your friends in a dark room while a strobe light is flashing, an air horn is blaring, and someone is throwing hundreds of baseballs at your head. That is what the onboard computers of these fighter jets are dealing with. The processing systems simply get overwhelmed. The computer starts seeing every radar return as a hostile threat, or worse, it gets so jammed with data that it sees nothing as a threat. The U.S. military has spent decades building these incredibly complex, networked, layered defense environments. But this conflict is proving that a layered defense environment actually becomes a fatal liability when it is overloaded with sheer volume.
And the data suggests it's getting worse. There is early, credible reporting coming across the wire that a fourth U.S. jet was downed over Iraq just hours ago.
What's truly fascinating here, and what should terrify Western military planners, is the sheer precision of the Iranian strikes that are getting through. They aren't just lobbing Scud missiles blindly into the desert hoping to hit a tent. According to the analysis by Karen Kwiatkowski and Scott Ritter, Iran's strike success rate on their designated critical targets is near 100%.
That's hard to believe, but the data supports it.
Think about that. If they aim for a specific billion-dollar radar dome in Qatar, they hit it. If they aim for a specific floor of a barracks building housing intelligence personnel, they hit that exact floor. Ritter has run the numbers on the visible satellite damage, and he estimates that the U.S. is already looking at over $100 billion in physical infrastructure damage across the theater.
$100 billion in a matter of weeks.
Yes. This is a complete, unmitigated failure of the legacy shock and awe doctrine. You cannot intimidate a decentralized, highly motivated enemy that has patiently mapped out every single node of your defense network over the last 20 years, and who now possesses the cheap, expendable precision munitions required to completely overwhelm it.
So, if the military hardware is failing, what does this all mean for the rest of the world? How does this affect the average listener who might think a war in the Middle East doesn't impact their daily life? This brings us to the third major phase of our analysis, the global economic choke point. Because while the military data is grim, the global economic data we are pulling is absolutely catastrophic. We have to talk about the Strait of Hormuz.
The jugular vein of the global economy.
Exactly. For those who aren't geography buffs, the Strait of Hormuz is a narrow waterway between Oman and Iran. At its narrowest point, the shipping lanes are only about 33 kilometers or 21 miles wide. But through that tiny bottleneck flows 20 to 21% of the entire world's daily oil supply and a massive portion of its liquefied natural gas. The hard data shows that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGC, has effectively closed this choke point. But they aren't doing it by lining up warships breast to breast. They are selectively blockading it. The strait is currently closed to all commercial shipping, with the explicit exception of Russian and Chinese flagged vessels, which are being allowed to pass unmolested.
And you, the listener, need to understand the mechanics of how a modern blockade works. The Iranians don't have to physically block the strait by sinking massive oil tankers in the channel to close it. They just have to alter the risk calculus for the maritime insurance markets in London.
Let's look at the financial hemorrhage that causes, because the numbers are jaw-dropping. Shipping insurance premiums have skyrocketed by 640% in a matter of days. Before this conflict kicked off, the insurance premium to transit a tanker through the strait was around 0.25% of the ship's hull value. So for a standard transit, a shipping company was paying about a $250,000 premium.
Right.
Today, that premium has spiked to 3%. That exact same transit, carrying the exact same cargo, now costs a staggering $3 million in insurance alone.
And at that price point, the profit margins for the energy companies vanish. It essentially freezes commercial shipping instantly. No captain is going to sail a $500 million vessel full of highly combustible fuel into a war zone where anti-ship missiles are actively flying, and no underwriter is going to insure them even if they tried.
And it gets worse for global energy markets. Qatar, which produces roughly a fifth of the entire global supply of liquefied natural gas, or LNG, has officially declared force majeure.
That's a huge deal.
It is. For those unfamiliar with the term, force majeure is a legal clause that frees a company from liability or obligation when an extraordinary event or circumstance beyond their control occurs. They have completely shut down production. It is not a temporary pause. They have flipped the switch to off. And the hard engineering data from the energy sector dictates that even if a peace treaty were signed this very afternoon, it would take a minimum of 2 to 4 weeks just to safely pressurize and restart those massive cryogenic facilities and get production back to previous baseline levels.
The immediate shockwaves of that shutdown are devastating.
We saw European natural gas prices instantly surge 46% to a 3-year high within hours of the announcement, and the financial contagion is spreading rapidly to Asia. The South Korean stock market plunged nearly 20% in a devastating Black Monday event.
Why South Korea specifically?
Because their entire economic model, their massive manufacturing sector that produces the cars, the electronics, the semiconductors the world relies on, is incredibly reliant on imported Gulf energy. When you cut off the LNG and the oil, you cut off the power to their factories, and the markets instantly price in a deep recession.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how this economic weapon, the blockade of the Strait, breaks the United States' closest allies long before a single shot is fired at their own homelands. According to the analysis by Michael Hudson, the renowned economist, and Alexander Mercouris, nations like India are facing a catastrophic scenario right now. India relies incredibly heavily on the Persian Gulf for its energy mix. Right now, due to the shipping halt, the Indian economy is facing a $15 billion a day loss in economic activity. They are in such dire straits that their diplomats are practically begging Washington for an emergency sanctions waiver to allow them to buy Russian oil in bulk, just to keep their lights on and their economy functioning.
And while Europe and India are panicking, how is China weathering this?
Contrast the panic in the West with the absolute calm in Beijing. China sits incredibly secure. For the last several years, while the West was distracted, China has been quietly, methodically building up a 1.5 billion barrel strategic petroleum reserve. They have a massive 6-month supply of oil sitting safely in onshore tanks. On top of that buffer, satellite tracking shows they currently have 166 million barrels of Iranian oil already loaded on massive tankers, just sitting safely at anchor in the South China Sea. China and Russia are entirely insulated from the energy shock that is currently ripping through Europe and the U.S.-aligned Asian nations. They are watching the West's economic engine seize up while their tanks are completely full.
And it's not just the macroeconomies of these giant nation-states that are failing, it's the microeconomies of the Gulf itself. The data out of the United Arab Emirates is fascinating. Let's look at Dubai.
Yes, the collapse of the Gulf Oasis. For decades, Dubai has built its entire glittering economic model on being the safe haven Switzerland of the Middle East. They offer no taxes, ultra-luxury real estate, massive shopping malls, man-made islands. It has been a playground for wealthy expatriates, Russian oligarchs, European bankers, and global influencers. But all of that existed under the perceived absolute security of the American military umbrella. The assumption was that the U.S. Navy and Air Force would never let anything touch Dubai.
And in a matter of days, that illusion has been completely shattered.
Iranian ballistic missiles hitting targets within the UAE have destroyed the psychological safety of the city. Wealthy expatriates are panicking. We are seeing reports of individuals paying up to $250,000 for a single charter flight out of the international airport just to get their families to Europe. You cannot sustain a luxury, real estate, tech hub, and tourism economy in a city that is actively being targeted by hypersonic missiles. The long-term economic viability of the entire Gulf Cooperation Council, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, is fundamentally in jeopardy. The Golden Goose is terrified, and it is fleeing.
With the air campaign failing to yield a swift victory and the economic toll mounting by the hour, Washington is scrambling. That brings us to our next phase of analysis: the illusory ground war and regional expansion. The hard data shows frantic, high-level discussions emerging from the Trump administration regarding the immediate need for a ground component to force a resolution. Specifically, there are leaked reports of a plan to aggressively arm Kurdish factions in the West, sending hundreds or perhaps thousands of fighters to launch a proxy ground invasion into western Iran with the hope of triggering a broader regime collapse.
I have to aggressively dismantle this idea, and the fundamental military realities make it abundantly clear why this is a fantasy. According to the analysis by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis and Colonel Doug McGregor, both of whom understand armored warfare and logistics deeply. This plan ignores the most basic, undeniable tenets of military geography.
Let's talk about that geography, because most people picture the Middle East as a flat, sandy desert.
Exactly, and that is a fatal misconception. Iran is not a flat desert. It is a massive mountainous fortress. The western border, right where they are proposing this Kurdish invasion, is defined by the Zagros Mountains. This is incredibly rugged, unforgiving, defensive terrain. It is full of deep valleys, sheer cliffs, and natural choke points that heavily favor a defending force. Let's look at the historical comparison that military planners use. Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. It took 300,000 fully mechanized, highly trained U.S. troops to invade Iraq. Iraq is a country roughly a quarter of the size of Iran, and it is situated on mostly flat, open desert terrain that is perfect for tank columns.
Than Iran's military size.
Iran possesses a combined military force, the regular army, the IRGC, and the besieged paramilitary of roughly 1 million active and reserve personnel. Standard military doctrine taught in every war college on Earth dictates that an attacking force needs a 3-to-1 advantage in manpower to succeed against a prepared defense, especially when that defense is dug into mountainous terrain.
If you do the math on a 1 million strong defending force, you're saying the U.S. would need 3 million troops.
Yes. The U.S. would need an impossible 3 million soldiers to mount a successful conventional invasion of Iran. The U.S. doesn't even have 3 million active duty personnel globally. So the idea of sending a few hundred or even a few thousand lightly armed Kurdish proxy fighters into the Zagros Mountains against a 1 million-man army is not a strategic masterstroke. It is an absolute death sentence for those fighters. Furthermore, because of the massive patriotic backlash we discussed earlier regarding the school bombing, an invasion by an armed, foreign-backed minority proxy will only serve to further unite the diverse Iranian populace, the Persians, the Azeris, the Lurs against a common foreign threat. It plays right into the Iranian government's hands.
So a ground invasion of Iran is mathematically and geographically off the table, but the data certainly points to an expansion of the conflict on the ground, just not in the way Washington planned. Let's shift our focus to the north, to the Lebanese front, because the situation there is deteriorating rapidly. Hezbollah has officially entered the war in full force. They have launched massive, highly coordinated rocket, missile, and drone swarms deep into Israeli territory. In response, the data shows Israel has fully mobilized its reserves, amassed heavy ground troops and armor at the northern border, and has actively invaded southern Lebanon, pushing their forces up to the Litani River.
And the civilian impact of that thrust into Lebanon is massive.
It's unprecedented. The Israeli military has ordered the mandatory evacuation of 700,000 people from the densely populated southern suburbs of Beirut, primarily the Dahi district. We are looking at satellite images of unprecedented gridlock, highways turned into parking lots, and the creation of a massive immediate humanitarian crisis as nearly 1 million people try to flee north simultaneously.
And opening this second brutal front is creating an unbearable internal crisis for Israel. According to the analysis by John Elmer and Robert Inlakesh, who monitor the tactical realities of these proxy conflicts, the situation on the ground in southern Lebanon is a meat grinder. Hezbollah in 2026 is not the Hezbollah of 2006. They are utilizing highly advanced, Russian-designed Kornet anti-tank guided missiles.
Explain what the Kornet missile does to a tank for those who think modern tanks are invincible.
A Kornet is a laser-guided, man-portable missile. It has a tandem warhead specifically designed to defeat modern reactive armor, like the armor on Israel's Merkava tanks. The first charge detonates the explosive armor plate, and the second charge burns a jet of molten copper right through the steel hull, incinerating the crew inside. Hezbollah is using these Kornets from hidden fortified tunnel positions to devastate Israeli armor columns and troop concentrations as they try to push through the narrow valleys of southern Lebanon. Israel is being bled heavily on the ground.
But the data shows they are also deeply vulnerable in the air right over their own cities.
Yes. The Iron Dome system, which is arguably the most famous missile defense system in the world, was brilliantly designed to intercept crude, unguided rockets fired from Gaza. But it is fundamentally failing against Iran's advanced Fatah ballistic missiles, which Hezbollah and Iran are now employing.
What makes the Fatah missile so different from a standard rocket?
A standard rocket flies on a predictable parabolic arc, like throwing a football. A computer can easily calculate where it will be in 5 seconds and shoot an interceptor at that spot. The Fatah is a maneuvering ballistic missile. In its terminal phase, as it plunges toward the Earth at hypersonic speeds, it actively shifts its trajectory. It jinks and weaves, making it nearly impossible for the Iron Dome interceptors to predict its path. And the data confirms these missiles are successfully bypassing the defense net and hitting high-value targets in Tel Aviv and Haifa.
The economic and psychological toll of this multi-front war on Israel is staggering. The hard economic numbers show Israel's economy is bleeding $2.9 billion a week due to the mobilization of the workforce, the halt in tourism, and the destruction of infrastructure. And perhaps the most telling data point of all, the one that truly signals the severity of the crisis. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has reportedly moved his official command plane, the Wings of Zion, which is the Israeli equivalent of America's Air Force One, outfitted with secure communications and anti-missile defenses. He has moved it out of the country entirely, relocating it to Berlin, Germany.
And you have to read between the lines on what that means. When the leader of a nation facing an existential conflict relocates his highly specialized billion-dollar airborne command center to a foreign continent, it is a massive, undeniable signal of profound internal vulnerability. It tells you, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that the Israeli leadership does not believe their own airspace or their heavily fortified underground airfields are secure from Iranian strikes.
Which brings us to the global implications. If the local airspace over Tel Aviv and the Gulf isn't secure, what about international waters? The conflict is spreading far beyond the Middle East. Let's move to the fifth phase of our analysis, the multipolar web, escalation, and geopolitical shifts. Because we have a shocking data point from the Indian Ocean that completely changes the scope of this war.
This is where the rules of the game change entirely.
The data confirms that a United States nuclear-powered submarine utilized a heavyweight torpedo to sink an Iranian naval frigate, the Iris Duna. But here is the critical context. This attack occurred in the Indian Ocean, just off the coast of Sri Lanka. The Duna was not engaged in combat operations. It was not escorting weapons to Hezbollah. It was returning from a routine peacetime naval exercise hosted by the Indian Navy. The casualty numbers are severe. 32 Iranian sailors were rescued by local Sri Lankan authorities, 87 bodies have been recovered from the water, and 61 sailors remain missing, presumed dead. To add intense fuel to this fire, U.S. Secretary of War Pete Hegseth went on public television and actively bragged about the attack, explicitly stating that the Iranian ship thought it was safe because it was sailing in international waters, and he wanted to prove them wrong.
What is deeply fascinating and terrifying about this event is how pivotal an escalation it represents in the grand scope of naval history. According to the analysis by Carl Zaw, attacking a sovereign naval vessel in international waters, thousands of miles outside the declared immediate theater of war, fundamentally alters the global rules of engagement.
It throws the rule book out the window.
Exactly. Furthermore, the reports indicate the U.S. submarine fired the torpedo and then immediately left the area, failing to render any aid or rescue the surviving mariners floundering in the ocean. That explicitly breaks deeply entrenched, unwritten maritime codes that date back centuries and violates formal international maritime laws regarding the rescue of shipwrecked sailors, even enemy ones. By publicly bragging about this, what is essentially a Pearl Harbor-style sneak attack in peacetime waters, the United States has unilaterally established a new, deadly precedent.
What does that precedent mean for the U.S. Navy?
It turns every single U.S. naval asset globally into a legitimate, symmetrical target for Iranian retaliation. If the U.S. is saying an Iranian ship isn't safe conducting peaceful transits off the coast of Sri Lanka, then Iran will argue that a U.S.-guided missile destroyer isn't safe porting in the Mediterranean or sailing through the Pacific or docking in Japan. It globalizes the threat matrix instantly. The U.S. Navy now has to look over its shoulder in every ocean on Earth.
This naturally leads us to look at the shadow players on the geopolitical chessboard. You, the listener, have to be wondering, where are Russia and China in all of this chaos? Are these massive multipolar powers stepping in directly to help Iran?
They don't need to step in directly with their own troops or planes. The grand strategy here for Beijing and Moscow is one of pure attrition. According to the analysis by geopolitical experts Alex Cristoforo and Glenn Deason, Russia and China are perfectly content to sit back, keep their hands seemingly clean, and watch the United States bleed its military stockpiles, drain its treasury, and destroy its diplomatic leverage in the sands of the Middle East. However, make no mistake, they are actively, aggressively shaping the battlefield from the shadows.
Give me the hard data on what China is doing.
China is providing Iran with unfettered, military-grade access to the Beidou satellite navigation system. Beidou is China's proprietary answer to the American GPS network. This is incredibly crucial. In past conflicts, the U.S. could simply scramble or jam the GPS signals over a war zone, rendering enemy smart weapons blind and useless. But because Iran is using the Chinese satellites, their ballistic missiles remain incredibly precise, totally immune to U.S. electronic warfare attempts. Furthermore, intelligence reports indicate China is supplying Iran with the specific chemical precursors needed to manufacture solid-fuel rocket propellants, as well as the specialized low-speed engines used in the Shahed drone swarms. China is ensuring that Iran's military-industrial complex never runs out of the raw materials needed to keep firing.
They are acting as the inexhaustible factory for the Iranian war effort and the Russian angle.
Vladimir Putin is brilliantly utilizing the chaos of this crisis to maximize the economic pain on the NATO allies that have been opposing him in Eastern Europe. Think about the energy vulnerability we discussed earlier. With European energy markets already in a state of absolute panic due to the Qatar LNG shutdown and the Strait of Hormuz blockade, Putin has publicly hinted at accelerating his timeline and completely cutting off all remaining Russian natural gas pipeline supplies to Europe far ahead of the previously scheduled 2027 phase-out.
He's twisting the knife.
He is weaponizing the geopolitical moment. He knows exactly what the math dictates. Europe simply cannot survive the simultaneous loss of Gulf LNG shipped by sea and Russian gas piped over land without facing severe immediate deindustrialization, rolling blackouts, and catastrophic double-digit inflation. Russia and China are orchestrating a masterclass in letting the United States and Europe completely exhaust themselves while Beijing and Moscow secure their own energy grids and resource networks.
Okay, we've covered a massive amount of ground today. We've gone from the tactical mistakes of the opening airstrikes to the depletion of billion-dollar defense grids to the staggering economic freeze in the shipping lanes and out to the grand maneuvers of China and Russia. Let's bring this all together for the listener.
Yes. For you, the listener who has stayed with us through this deep analysis, there is a final, highly provocative thought I want you to mull over as you watch the news this week. We spent a lot of time talking about the physical hardware, the drones, the hypersonic interceptors, the sunken ships in the Indian Ocean. But the true, ultimate casualty of this sprawling war might not be a military asset at all. The biggest casualty might be the petrodollar.
Explain what the petrodollar is and why it's the foundation of everything.
Think about the grand, unwritten bargain that has defined the global economy and American prosperity for decades. In the 1970s, a deal was struck. The incredibly wealthy Gulf monarchies, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, agreed to price their oil exports exclusively in United States dollars. Furthermore, they agreed to take those massive trillion-dollar oil profits and park them directly into U.S. financial markets and U.S. Treasury bonds. In exchange for essentially propping up the American currency and keeping U.S. interest rates low, the United States provided an ironclad, invincible military umbrella, guaranteeing the absolute security of those royal families and their oil fields.
The illusion of invincibility we talked about in Dubai.
Exactly. And in less than a week, Iran has irrevocably proved that the American umbrella has massive gaping holes in it. It is fundamentally failing its primary mission. If the Gulf states look around and realize that the United States military cannot protect their billion-dollar early warning radars in Qatar, cannot protect their vital desalination plants in the UAE, cannot protect their sprawling oil fields from drone swarms, and cannot even protect the diplomatic CIA stations in their own capital cities, the core question becomes, why would they continue to hold up their end of the bargain? Why would they continue to prop up the U.S. dollar if the security guarantee is void? If that foundational pillar of military security crumbles, the entire global economic arrangement tied to the petrodollar will crumble alongside it. So the coming weeks, as the media focuses on the explosions, I urge you to watch not just the battlefields in Lebanon or the Persian Gulf. Watch the global bond markets. Watch the currency exchanges. Watch the gold reserves. The geopolitical tectonic plates are shifting beneath our feet in ways we haven't seen since the end of World War II.
Let's distill the core takeaway for the rest of the week. The hard data from all the events we've tracked leads to one undeniable conclusion. The traditional Western military doctrine, which relies heavily on exorbitant, legacy, shock, and awe hardware, is fundamentally failing against a decentralized, cheap, and highly adaptable asymmetric warfare strategy. You simply cannot defeat $50,000 drones with $13 million missiles indefinitely. The math will eventually break you. And the resulting economic shockwaves from this severe military mismatch are actively rewriting global power dynamics and economic alliances in real time. If you found this analysis valuable, hit the plus or follow button on your podcast app and give us a like. Subscribe to the Hot News channel for more deep dives. Until we meet again, goodbye.